The following episode is in no way intended to paint the Weaver family in a bad or particularly unjustly positive light. While parts of their real and alleged religious and personal beliefs may have, on occasion, been omitted for brevity or to better maintain situational objectivity, the purpose of this episode is to detail the true story, not the one the media sold you, or the mythologizing you may have heard that was disseminated by some fringe movements in the years that followed, but the most factually accurate and unbiased presentation of truth possible. We will mainly be focusing on highlighting the legal aspects from both sides in an attempt to lay out the pertinent details of this case and allow you, the listener, the opportunity to form an objective opinion on what really happened regarding the siege on Ruby Ridge, as well as the events that led up to it, while at the same time avoiding philosophical debate surrounding what anyone involved may or may not have said or believed outside of what is essential to fully and accurately tell this story. Because at the end of the day, what you agree or disagree with regarding their beliefs is ultimately irrelevant in determining if what occurred constituted excessive force and government overreach, or if their actions, not words, warranted the events that began the last week of August, 1992. No details pertinent to those events have been intentionally omitted, and great care has been taken to ensure that, as well as to ensure accuracy, to the very best of our ability. Thank you for listening.
It was the pre-dawn hours of August 21st, 1992, in the rugged wilds of Northern Idaho, right along the foothills of Bottleneck and Roman Nose Peak along the Selkirk Mountains, and 6 U.S. Marshals led by Deputy US Marshal Art Roderick, and including Larry Cooper, William Bill Degan, Frank Norris, Joseph Thomas, and David Hunt. They'd slipped out of their temporary base at Schweitzer Mountain condo around 2:30 a.m. They were fully geared up, covered in camouflage from head to toe, armed with M16 rifles chambered in .223, a suppressed 9mm Colt submachine gun for Cooper, along with their various sidearms, and equipped with night vision goggles, their radios occasionally crackling to life softly, but the sound wouldn't make it far in these dense trees. This was Operation Northern Exposure. Intended as a pure reconnaissance mission, their instructions were deceptively simple. Surveil only. No arrests today. It would be too risky at this point, and the chance for collateral damage too high. Just put eyes on the target and scout ambush points for the planned future takedown. They had been prepping for days, zeroing in their weapons, studying grainy videos taken of the property by the various choppers that had carefully skirted its edges in the weeks prior. Their plan? Get in, observe the Weaver's cabin from afar, ascertain who was there and what sort of weapons they were packing, map the layout, and slip out undetected. The team piled into a van and a jeep, but ditched the van at the local sheriff's place before parking the jeep at nearby Rao residence around 4:30 a.m. The Rao family were among the Weavers' closest neighbors, but no friends, quite the opposite. Under the cover of darkness, they hiked the steep forested trails of Ruby Ridge, a 20-acre plot perched some 4,800 feet up one of the 4 ridges along the mountains. The air is crisp, the terrain unforgiving. Loose rocks, dense undergrowth, and switchbacks where one wrong step could lead to a very rough trip back down. Degan, a 42-year-old Special Operations Group veteran, was handpicked for his expertise. His full loadout included a specialized M16A2 carbine sniper rifle, but it was left behind for this leg of the journey. At a trail fork known as the Y, a muddy intersection where paths diverged towards the cabin, they split up. The OP, or the observation post, team of Hunt, Norris, who was the medic, and Thomas head up to a ridge top perch about half a mile north and 900 feet above the cabin, sitting hunkered down under a white pine with spotting scopes, cameras, and video gear. Their job? Watch and report. The recon team of Roderick, Cooper, and Degan pushed closer, scouting their potential cover positions for a future op. They would creep in about 200 to 250 yards of the cabin, crawling to a rock outcrop for a better view. Around 9 a.m., they link up briefly with the OP team to swap notes. They noted that the Weavers were up and stirring about. 14-year-old Sammy and 30-year-old family friend Kevin Harris were walking around the perimeter, allegedly doing security sweeps, accompanied by Sammy's yellow lab, Striker. The teams would then head back to their positions, but the recon team, led by Roderick, would advance theirs. He would end up dangerously close to the cabin, maybe 100 to 150 yards from it, near the garden and spring house. Roderick would then toss a couple of rocks towards the Weaver cabin, not to provoke, according to the marshals, but to test if the dog would notice and bark, and to gauge the response of the family. The team held their breath, but nothing. Later, however, Stryker would start following the agents in the recon team. They would pull back, radioing the OP that they were entering the hot zone. Sammy and Harris would notice that Stryker had headed into the woods and would soon follow him. Harris would later say that they did so hoping that Stryker had spotted a game animal, because the cabin was dangerously low or out of meat at this point. At roughly 10 a.m., something happened. Exactly what the catalyst was depends on who you ask, but what is undisputable is that Stryker was alerted to the recon team, and Sammy, barefoot and carrying his .223 Mini 14, Randy equipped with a double-barrel 12-gauge, and Harris with a 30-06 bolt-action rifle, all rolled out of the cabin to investigate. Accounts vary, but all primary sources seem to agree that the two daughters, Sarah and Rachel, as well as the baby, of course, remained at the cabin with Vicky. Sammy and Harris run behind Stryker, while Randy peels off west in an attempt to cut off any game or possible threats that Stryker is trying to flush out. The recon team sprints back towards the Y junction for cover. Stryker would arrive at the marshal's position first. Tail high, nose working the ground like he's flushing a deer. Sammy and Harris close behind him. They have no idea at this point that 3 of the 6 camouflaged U.S. Deputy Marshals are crouched in the bushes less than 50 yards away from them. Stryker would spot the Marshals first, and upon alerting their position, Art Roderick would emerge from cover, his rifle ready, and fire on Stryker with a single shot from his M16A1. The 65-grain bullet would enter Stryker as he turned to run, striking him in the tail area and erupt from his chest. Stryker would drop mid-stride, barely able to let out a quick, simple yelp before collapsing. Upon seeing his dog being killed in front of him, Sammy's scream split the mountain air.
"You killed my dog, you son of a bitch!"
Sammy would return fire, sending 3 rounds in proximity of Roderick's head. Cooper would react quickly, firing at Sammy. He and Harris would take cover behind a nearby stump. Harris, once behind cover, would return fire. Bill Degan, behind his own stump, shoulders his M16 and fires off a 7-round burst in the direction of Sammy and Harris. Before he was able to make it 8 rounds, Harris would return fire, sending a round from his 30-06 through Degan's chest and exploding through his back. He would die at the scene a short time later. One of the most hotly contested and critical moments would come next, as Sammy began to retreat back up the hill towards the cabin, when a single shot would rip through him, back to front, dropping the 14-year-old where he stood. Harris would attempt to return fire, driving Cooper back behind his cover. It was only at this point, according to Harris, that he heard Cooper identify himself as a U.S. Marshal. Harris would crawl over to check on Sammy and found that he was already dead. At this point, Harris would retreat, scrambling back up the hill towards the cabin. Back down at the Y, radios crackled to life with the words that no officer ever wants to say. "Officer down. 4 lives will end on this ridge before the sun sets the following day. Lives will be forever changed, and the federal response will be put under a microscope for ever-altering protocols and rules of engagement. What began with the single crack of a rifle and the death of a family dog will soon burn itself into the American psyche as the siege of Ruby Ridge. But to fully understand how a simple surveillance mission erupted into a bloodbath and then a full-on military-style siege of a small family cabin, we have to go back further, much further. So buckle up, because tonight we will be taking a critical look back as we descend into the darkness and attempt to fully unwind one of America's many avoidable tragedies: the assault on Ruby Ridge.
Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 3.
Good evening, curious minds out there around the world, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 12, Operation Northern Exposure, the Ruby Ridge Tragedy. We have a lot to get into this evening, so I won't waste a whole lot of this time up front, but I really just want to welcome you all back after our October spooky season break, and I guess thank you all for tuning in, checking out this episode. I briefly ran through some of the details of this story way back in Season 1 during the Oklahoma City bombing episode, but I felt like this one really deserved to have a full episode to try to fully cover and unpack what really took place, as well as the aftermath and what, if any, changes were actually made to prevent something like this from ever happening again. As you will soon understand, if you don't already, This was a pivotal moment in the country's history, and the ripple effects would be felt for decades after. Books have been written, documentaries have been made, and the story has been told countless times by many journalists, documentarians, content creators over the years, and while some details have been well established at this point, many others tend to change with every single telling. So I thought it would be worth it to really try and dig into this case objectively and attempt to piece together the details of what really transpired over those 10 main fateful days back in August of '92. What you're about to hear is the culmination of intense research and fact-checking. Condensed from the report of the Ruby Ridge Task Force, the FBI's final incident report via FOIA request, the Senate Judiciary Committee report, the 1997 DOJ IOG report on FBI management failures and criminal civil case court documents, as well as numerous other verified sources, books, and reporting that's been done on the incident. All of which, hopefully, will paint one of the clearest and most complete accounts of these events to date. So with all of that being said and out of the way, let's go ahead and get back into it. Chapter 1. The Beginning. While I don't intend to waste too much time on their early lives, some basic background info on the Weaver family is actually necessary to really understand how this story began. Randy Weaver was born to a farming family on January 3, 1948 in Villisca, Iowa. His parents, Clarence and Wilma Weaver, owned a small farm in Villisca and were known to be deeply religious, but they struggled to find a denomination that aligned with their strict religious views. The family would bounce around from Baptist, Presbyterian to evangelical churches in the area, but never seemed to quite find a spiritual home. Randy would attend and later graduate from Jefferson High School in May of 1966. He would attend classes at Iowa Central Community College for the following 2 years, where he would take prerequisites aimed towards, of all things, a career in criminal justice, but would drop out in '68 to serve his country in the U.S. Army. This was the peak of the Vietnam War, and support for it was still very high in most parts of the country. While it's a point of contention today, Weaver would successfully complete Green Beret training and was wanting to be sent to Vietnam to join the fight, but that wouldn't be in the cards for him. He would end up instead being stationed in North Carolina at Fort Bragg and would work as an Army engineer up until his discharge in '71. Victoria Vicky Jordison, later Weaver, was born in 1949 and grew up in Fort Dodge, Iowa, roughly 42 miles from where Randy grew up and attended high school. She was born into another traditional farm family much like Randy's that was also devoutly religious and active in their church, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, a restorationalist church that is technically a branch of the Mormon faith, though it generally rejects the term Mormon when referring to its congregation's members. Vicky was said to have been very active in 4-H while attending high school at Fort Dodge Senior High, up until her graduation in '67. 1 year before Randy's discharge, while on leave and visiting his parents, Randy would travel to Fort Dodge with some friends where he would meet his future wife. Vicky at the time was working as a secretary for Sears Roebuck, and the pair would instantly hit it off. They would end up meeting up nearly every night during his leave, and following his discharge at the rank of sergeant on October 8th of '71, the pair would get married only a month later. Randy would attempt to finish his education and attend a seminar at the University of Northern Iowa, but would drop out once again when he found a high-salary job at the local John Deere factory. The pair would remain there in Cedar Falls and for several years enjoyed by all accounts a happy, normal marriage. In 1976, the couple would welcome their first child, Sarah, into the world, and Vicky, according to her sister, Julie, would enthusiastically enter motherhood and spend the next 2 years raising Sarah as a stay-at-home mother. In 1978, everything would begin to change, and Vicky would begin to see the world through a Christianity-centric, apocalyptic lens. By most accounts, it started with her reading of Hal Lindsey's 1970 book, The Late Great Planet Earth, comparing end-time biblical prophecies with then-current events, attempting to predict future events based on the unfulfilled prophecies. It was one of the first really popular, the end is nigh, if you will, books discussing how the U.S. had become a, quote, revived Roman Empire destined to be ruled over by the Antichrist, and that we were living in the quote-unquote end times. While people have literally said and believed this since the Bible was made widely available, this one really struck a chord with Vicky, and her search for the truth would lead her to libraries and bookstores in a quest to her and her family ahead of the nuclear holocaust and Armageddon that she now believed was just around the corner. To get some distance from this oncoming Great Tribulation and the Christian persecution that she saw coming, she and Randy began discussing moving as far as possible away from the rest of society, false governments, desperate people, and those who she felt would sooner or later be coming to hunt down the true believers. Her and Randy would soon begin meeting other like-minded, radical Christians and organized regular meetups, with some of them at Sambo's restaurant there in Cedar Falls. Vicky had dove headfirst into studying the Bible for the answers on how to live and best survive the coming tribulations. A passage in the book of Matthew, actually 24:16, would reinforce her desire to get her family away from society and give her the answer that she was seeking. That passage is, quote, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And so this would become her plan. She began to tell Randy a recurring dream, an omen of what was to come. But she also saw in her dream a beautiful and peaceful mountaintop to retreat, where her and her family could be safe from the evil and coming apocalypse. She would also birth their second child, Samuel, on April 23rd of 78. They would begin putting more and more of their time and resources towards Vicky's vision of a safe haven high in the mountains. And for the following 4 years, she would plan, and Randy would work, save, and acquire the guns that he felt would play a key role in protecting his family from what was to come. In 1982, their plan would officially be put into motion. Chapter 2. The Dream. By 1982, Vicky was pregnant with their third child, Rachel, and growing more and more determined to obtain their dream of escaping the evils of society and finding a safe place to raise their growing family. The following year, in 1983, having welcomed their third child into the world, they decided that it was now or never. To accomplish this, the Weavers began selling their possessions to raise the money that was needed. The TV, the riding mower, even wedding gifts, whatever it took. Soon, Randy was able to secure a 20-acre plot in rural Boundary County, Idaho, for the $5,000 that they raised selling off their things and the moving truck they used to get there. On it, Randy would build a rough cabin without any water or electricity. It wasn't much, but they made it a home. Vicky would homeschool their children, a violation of Iowa law at the time, which stated that all instructors, parents or otherwise, had to be a licensed teacher or state-certified teacher. Luckily, while it was technically illegal, it also existed as a bit of a legal gray area, and there was no laws on the books guiding enforcement for it. Little did they know, but soon this would be the last of their worries. The Weavers would make a few friends locally in spite of their separatist ideals. The land that they found was in the foothills, the Selkirk Mountains, along a ridge in its eastern slopes called Ruby Ridge. Randy would later say that Ruby Ridge was just a, quote, media fabrication, and that it was actually called Caribou Ridge, but maps of the area tend to say otherwise. Before long, the Weavers would meet a 16-year-old kid named Kevin Harris, who they would basically adopt as family, something that was missing in Kevin's life. His father passed away when he was only 2 and was raised by a revolving cast of stepfathers. Kevin was the self-described troubled kid when he met the Weavers, but they saw something in him. And despite having very little for themselves a lot of the time, they still welcomed Kevin into their home whenever he needed a place to go, and there was always a place to sleep and food on the table whenever he came over. According to Kevin's trial testimony, there was a period of about 8 months in '84, just after the cabin was completed, that he lived full-time with the Weavers. He shared meals, joined in on family Bible studies that would stretch for hours about revelations and this one-world government prophecy. Sarah, Sammy, and Rachel warmed up to him quickly. He and Sammy would become like brothers before long, and Randy treated them like both an older son and an apprentice, teaching him all about hunting, cleaning game, and imparting onto him all the lessons that a good father would. Vicky's letters from this time period speak highly of him, and how our young brother, Kevin, was fitting right in with them. Kevin would chip right in with the daily chores that came along with self-sufficiency. The Weavers lived off of the land, growing their own vegetables and hunting their own meat. The life was tough at times, but it allowed them to exist independent of government and away from the society that they were progressively wanting less and less to do with. So in some ways, those early years were idyllic. Over time, however, the cracks would begin to show as Vicky and by default Randy would become more and more extreme in their Christian beliefs. By the mid-1980s, they had largely adopted identity Christianity, a racial interpretation of the scripture that believes only members of the Aryan race are the true descendants of the Israelites. Despite trying out several small fundamentalist and Seventh-day Adventist-type churches locally, They never officially joined any congregations, as Vicky always found them too worldly, despite several online sources stating that they attended the Church of Christ Christian, where Richard Butler was the founder and pastor. There is zero evidence of this, and by 85 to 86 they had stopped really attending any church at all and were instead holding their own family worship and Bible study at the cabin. After moving around and doing various jobs, by the fall of 86, Kevin Harris had started spending more time at the cabin. In his absence, though, Harris had met some members of the Aryan Nation and occasionally attended a few of their Congress meetings. He would later state it was mostly just for the party atmosphere, gun trading, and to have something to do in a very isolating and rural area that was largely devoid of activities for someone his age. Before we get too deep into all of that, though, it's probably best to rewind just a bit to late 84, early 85, when Randy and his neighbor Terry Kennison got into a nasty dispute over a $3,000 land deal that went bad. Kennison would sue Randy, but lost badly in court and was ordered to pay the $3,000 and $2,100 in court costs and damages. Bitter as hell, Kennison cooks up a revenge plot and begins first spreading rumors and then writes anonymous letters to the FBI, Secret Service, and the Boundary County Sheriff's Office claiming that Randy is a, quote, dangerous extremist who has threatened to assassinate Pope John Paul II, then President Ronald Reagan, and then Idaho Governor John Evans. Kennison also alleges that Randy is hoarding illegal weapons and is deeply involved with the Aryan Nation, all per his letter quoted in the 95 Senate Judiciary Subcommittee report. The full report is in the research folder for this episode. Kennison would later admit that it was just set as payback, but in January of 85, the feds would take the bait. Chapter 3. The Nightmare Begins. As a direct result of Kennison's letters, the Secret Service would open a formal threat probe, standard for threats of this nature. They would interview a few locals and get more second-hand gossip that Kennison had planted. The rumor mill has it that Randy had been to a, quote, few Aryan Nation congresses in Hayden Lake, located about 70 miles south, and that he allegedly hangs out with white separatists like Frank Kumnick, a supposed Aryan Nation associate that Randy did know casually from gun trading circles. Crucially, though, there was zero hard proof, no photos, no attendee list bearing his name, and no Aryan Nation witnesses placing Randy as ever having been there. So while you will likely see mention of Randy having attended Aryan Nation events during this time, it was pure hearsay. Hearsay that was planted by Kennison and amplified by his letters and the investigation that followed. The feds were already hyper-vigilant to all things Idaho-related and remotely smelling of extremism. This is largely due to the actions of a neo-Nazi terrorist group that operated in Idaho at the time known as the Order, or the Silent Brotherhood, who had gone on a crime spree from September of 83 to December of 84, where they robbed multiple places, including banks and an armored car, bombed targets, counterfeited money, all in a bid to raise funds with the end goal of a revolution against the U.S. government. So needless to say, the letters and rumors piqued their interest. On February 12th of 85, a joint team would roll up to the Weaver cabin unannounced, made up of 2 FBI agents and 2 Secret Service agents, including Byron Quick, as well as Boundary County Sheriff Ellis and his chief investigator. The group hiked in to have an interview with the Weavers and tried to get to the bottom of things. They would speak with Randy and Vicky for roughly 2 hours by their wood stove as the kids played outside. The meeting was tense but civil. According to the Secret Service transcript/debrief, Randy denied all threats, adding the line, quote, "I wouldn't waste ammo on politicians like that," which is low-key, kind of a great line. He also denied any Aryan Nation membership or affiliation, adding, quote, "I've got no time for their preachers, my faith straight from the Bible." He admits to knowing Kumnick, but that neither of them was a member of the Aryan Nation, though Kumnick was, quote, associated with the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord stuff, and that he traded guns with him sometimes, but stressed that he wasn't interested in that group and he's not a joiner. The feds would leave empty-handed, no arrests nor charges. The official probe would wrap up in May after they confirmed that the threats were totally bogus, when Kennison's smear campaign was exposed but was never ever prosecuted. The damage was done though. Weaver was already flagged in a federal database as a, quote, potential Aryan Nation associate with weapons cache. While that wasn't substantiated by their investigation, which determined that those claims were, quote, unsubstantiated hearsay, that was contradicted by the evidence. His initial flagging in the system would persist and would later play a pivotal role in the events that would lead to the siege of Ruby Ridge. Later that same month, on February 28th of 85, Randy and Vicky would swear an affidavit with the county courthouse alleging that Kennison and personal enemies were running a smear campaign to provoke the FBI into attacking and killing the Weaver family. On May 6th, the Weavers would also send a letter to Reagan personally apologizing if their enemies had forged letters to him making threats supposedly from the Weavers and would beg for further investigation into the false reports. Ironically, prosecutors would later twist this letter and use it against them, labeling it as Overt Act 7 in their conspiracy charge. They would never receive any response to their letters. These events would only further convince the increasingly isolationist Weavers that the government was out to get them. They would stop going into town except for when it was absolutely necessary. Randy would grow out his beard, start dressing in camo everywhere, and doing all that he could to lay low. Aryan Nation and other white nationalists, as well as just militia-type groups, would become a focus of a media campaign to paint them all in the same light, sending a strong message that any militia-type group was the same as the other radical right-wing extremists and hell-bent on overthrowing the U.S. government. This would have the desired effect of terrifying the public, who, frightened and angry, would call upon Congress to do something. In response, the FBI and ATF would begin sending agents in to infiltrate these groups in a COINTELPRO type operation to evaluate the threat level, arrest any lawbreakers, and work to undermine them from the inside. Meanwhile, money is getting tighter and tighter for the progressively more isolated Weavers. Part-time logging jobs had all but dried up. Kevin Harris began staying in the recently completed loft of the cabin, and the family was living on little more than venison and occasional small game, a fish, and some home-canned beans at this point. Aside from that, it's just whatever Randy can barter for on his few trips into town. In the summer of '86, Kevin Harris would encourage Randy to attend his first Aryan Nations Congress event by persuading him with the potential of a one-day trip to sell a few boxes of ammo that would allow him to be able to eat for a month. Randy would eventually concede, and he sets up a small folding table outside the chapel where he sells reloads and a beat-up Ruger Mini 14. What he hears of the quote-unquote preaching seems too extreme for his taste and closer to feelings that Vicky had grown to hold strongly, at least as far as the anti-government separatist goes. Randy would also meet a biker-looking guy who introduces himself as Gus Mangisano. Gus would buy 50 rounds off of Randy and starts talking to him about prepping for, quote, the day the grid goes down. Randy pockets the cash and doesn't think much of it, heading home right after the sale. He would later tell Vicky that they were mostly welfare cases with swastika tattoos. Since his first trip went well though, between then and 1988, whenever money would get a little tight, he and Kevin would drive down there, sell a little bit of reloaded ammo, mingle for a moment, and then head home. This would happen 3 to 4 times total. Randy never signs anything, never joins up, and always comes home as soon as possible. Gus would always show up to his table with cash though, and always pushing for Randy to bring him something with a shorter barrel. Randy brushed him off multiple times, telling him, quote, I don't do illegal guns, brother. From late 88 to early 89, Gus would begin trying to worm his way in with Randy more and more, and soon would begin showing up to the Weavers' home uninvited. He would come bearing gifts of beer, venison jerky, and always with cash, clearly trying to cultivate a relationship with Randy. He would persist with asking for illegal weapons, and always saying that he would be willing to pay top dollar for them. Weaver would brush him off once more, saying, I'm a family man, Gus. I don't build assassin weapons. Gus keeps on though. Continuing raising the price and the rhetoric, he begins trying new approaches, like saying that he needs them for, quote, protecting the compound when the Zogs start rounding them up. For those unaware, Zog stands for Zionist-occupied government, something that Vicky had come to strongly believe in and was a recurring bad guy for the Christian separatist movements that Vicky studied at the time. In October of '89, Gus would come knocking once again, this time with a very specific ask. The direct quote was, quote, just take 2 regular shotguns, cut the barrels to 10 inches, thread the ends, $300 cash each. I've got the guns right here in the truck. Randy hesitates at first. He knows that what he is being asked to do is a felony, but at the same time, winter was upon them and the family was already in pretty bad shape heading into it. So in the winter of '89 into '90, Randy decides that it is too tempting to turn down such easy money when they so badly need it. While he thinks it still sounds a little crazy for what he's asking, Randy already had the impression by this point that Gus seemed to have a little more money than sense, and figures that either he lacks the tools or the know-how to pull it off himself. So Randy takes the guns to a small plywood shop where he uses a hacksaw and a file to give Gus what he wants. He assures Kevin and Sammy, who's 12 now, that it was just a favor for a friend in trouble. Apparently, Gus had also told Randy that he needed them for a guy willing to pay double that, and he desperately needed that money for some reason. Gus would leave the 2 guns with Randy, a Mossberg and a Winchester, for him to work on. And then 8 days later, on October 11th, they would meet up at a restaurant in Sandpoint for a pre-delivery chat. Gus would give Randy a $150 down payment of sorts after he agrees to do it, and Randy would brag that it would be easy and that he could do 4 or 5 a week if the shop was set up. On October 24th, Randy would meet Gus at a park in Sandpoint, just off of the highway for the exchange. Unbeknownst to Randy at this point, the man that he was introduced to as Gus Mangisano was in reality a paid ATF informant named Kenneth Fadley, who had been helping the ATF infiltrate the Aryan nations, and his handler, ATF case agent Herbert Herb Byerly, was monitoring Fadley, who was wearing a wire from a van nearby. Randy hands over the 2 shotguns, barrels sawed to roughly 13 inches, 5 inches shorter than the legally allowed 18, without registering it, paying the tax, and receiving government approval. They have a brief discussion and Fadley counts out the money. Randy takes the cash and leaves, stopping on the way home to buy the family groceries. And I just want to chime in real quick here to say that the amount that he actually got paid for this, it's kind of all over the place. I've seen some later accounts say that it was $600, $300 for each gun, but according to the testimony, the ATF transcripts, and even Randy later, it was either $300 for both guns and $450 if you include the $150 deposit, if that was separate than the $300, which Randy says it was. I don't know. They kind of go back and forth, it seems like. But I just wanted to try to be as accurate as possible in that. I believe earlier I had said it was $600, $300 for each, but that was based on some early reporting that I was going through. So I just want to clarify that the total was either $300 or $450. Kind of irrelevant, but details matter in things like this. In late October to November 30th, a series of significant events would take place, starting with Fadley, Gus, wanting to follow up with more work for Randy, which he initially agrees to. Sometime in late October, Randy is warned through an intermediary, a message from Rico V, later ID'd as FBI informant Rico Valentino, who was also trying to infiltrate the same groups, that Gus was a Fed and not to deal with him. Both agencies are running separate, overlapping ops into the same small pool of Aryan Nation/white separatist gun runners. The FBI considered the Aryan Nation compound its highest priority domestic terrorism threat, and it spent years cultivating sources on the inside of its leadership, and did not want a bunch of low-level ATF gun stings to spook the bigger fish. Fadley was supposedly burning FBI sources. He was loud, pushy, and kept trying to buy the most illegal stuff possible at every Congress. The Aryan Nation Security, where Rico worked as an FBI mole, had gotten suspicious of everyone who talked to Gus. Had Fadley's op kept rolling, the FBI feared the whole compound would go dark and years of work would just be wasted. So, according to the 94 DOJ Ruby Ridge Task Force report, as well as the 95 Senate hearings, the FBI, through Valentino, deliberately leaked that Gus, Fadley, was law enforcement in order to protect their own op. Randy would pen a letter to his Aryan Nation contracts that the man known as Gus Mangisano is law enforcement, don't deal with him anymore. Randy would also confront Fadley over the phone at some point, but doesn't completely cut ties just yet. Fadley and the ATF plan a follow-up meeting at a hotel in Sandpoint. Randy shows up expecting that they would discuss more guns or payments, but as soon as they meet, his paranoia takes over. He directly confronts Fadley about being a cop and demands proof that he isn't. Randy asks him, quote, "Who tipped you off about me?" adding, "You smell like feds. Show me you're clean or we're done." Fadley would attempt to shift the blame onto the, quote, "mud people starting shit." The argument would escalate though, and Randy would walk away with nothing exchanging hands. Little did Randy know that he was already deep in with the ATF's trap, and there was nothing that he could do to escape it at this point. Well, there was one thing. Chapter 4, The Deal. The second shotgun sting was supposed to be the big win. The ATF's undercover informant, Kenneth Fadley, the biker that Weavers had come to know as Gus, had spent months trying to cultivate Randy as a potential target. After being warned off by Rico V, Randy had become ever increasingly paranoid and distrustful of Fadley. By the time the second shotgun sale was being orchestrated, Randy's distrust had reached a fever pitch, and he refused to move forward without proof that he wasn't law enforcement. Something that would be impossible to really prove to begin with, but in truth, Randy's mind was already made up. Agents watched helplessly as their big bust moment blew up in their face, and the ATF saw in real time months of work go completely sideways. They only had the FBI to blame in reality, but it would soon come crashing down on Randy Weaver. Thanks to the ATF and FBI pissing match, not only was the second setup an epic L, but Fadley and Gus Mangisano's character had been outed as a Fed and cast suspicion over everyone that he had dealings with. This completely collapsed the ATF's gun-running operation, forcing them to pivot and just use what they still had. The ATF never wanted Randy Weaver, but his Aryan Nation connection, Kumnik, was one of their main targets. and now that they no longer had a way to gather evidence on him from within, their plans of trapping and turning Weaver had to go into overdrive. They had hoped to get another recorded cell to fatally, one that didn't stink so badly of entrapment, but now they had no choice but to just run with what they had. It was June 12, 1990, and a government-issued sedan carrying Fatale's ATF handler Herb Byerly and Special Agent Steve Gunderson, or at least that's one of the multiple contradictory statements given regarding this meeting by the ATF itself, statements including conflicting dates, locations, and even participants. So bad was it that the 1994 DOJ task force that was convened to investigate what happened and why noted that the ATF's documentation during this period was, quote, incomplete, inconsistent, or internally contradictory. And I'm here to tell you, they were being generously diplomatic when they said that. It's a very confusing mess and a huge pain to fact check. We will dig more into that in the BTR though. For now, what's important is that Byerly and Steve Gunderson, at least, met with Randy, maybe at his home, possibly at a motel in Deep Creek. It isn't really relevant, but what was discussed, however, would become a very pivotal moment in the story of Ruby Ridge and the lives of the Weaver family. Byerly and Gunderson approached Randy, badged out, and introduced themselves as federal agents. According to Byerly's later testimony, they showed Randy evidence that linked Weaver to the shotgun deal and laid out an ask. It began with Byerly saying, "Randy, we need to talk about Gus and the guns." Sources differ again here, though, by some accounts including Randy's testimony and other investigative documents, as well as later writing by investigative journalists and historians, which all tends to agree that either Byerly explicitly offered to have the gun charges dropped, or that it was at least strongly implied that if Randy would agree to become a CI, a confidential informant, for the investigation into the Aryan Nation, they wanted him to gather information on certain targets and activities associated with the group, particularly in their main compound down in Hayden Lake, and then to report back to them regularly. If he did as they asked, then they would have the charges dismissed, and otherwise they would ensure that he would be arraigned on the gun charges. Whether they inferred that he could help himself by doing this, or if they straight up made an explicit offer, would quickly become irrelevant, because Randy didn't hesitate. He didn't deliberate. He simply, in no uncertain terms, immediately and categorically refused, saying that he would not snitch and that they could go to hell. He also informed them that it was against his beliefs and morally reprehensible to befriend people and gain their trust solely for the purpose of betraying them. Randy wasn't interested in joining the Aryan Nation anyway, and he certainly wasn't going to do it just for the sake of helping the government. Before they departed, though, Byerly would hand Randy his name and contact info and ask Randy to get in touch if he decided to cooperate. Randy wasn't interested, and for the following 6 months, life at the Weaver home would, for the most part, return to normal. The ATF sat on the October '89 shotgun evidence for the time being, and there was no further contact between the ATF and the Weavers, and for a brief moment at least, it seemed that nothing much may come of it. In reality, though, the feds had all they needed to at least make Randy's life hell. So while the ATF does nothing publicly, no arrest, no further contact, they had the tapes, photos, and enough to charge him in a case that they had prepared for over 2 years. In December of 1990, a secret grand jury in Boise, Idaho would return a sealed 2-count indictment against Randy. While the exact wording of the indictment was never made publicly available, he was charged with federal firearms violations related to making and possessing illegal unregistered sawed-off shotguns under the National Firearms Act of 26 U.S.C. 5861. along with its related provisions. U.S. Magistrate Stephen L. Ayers would sign out a bench warrant the same day, authorizing the ATF to apprehend Randy. On January 17th of 1990, ATF agents along with the Boundary County Sheriff would stage a stalled vehicle, a camper, hood up, agents inside, with one posing as a stranded motorist, directly in the route that Randy and Vicky would be taking to town. They had received a tip from a local informant that they were due to make a supply run, and that the children usually always stayed at home. So agents saw this as the perfect opportunity. Vicky had previously filed an affidavit with the Boundary County Clerk, which, among other things, gave, quote, legal notice that we believe we may have to defend our family from physical attacks on our lives, relating to the federal government. So the ATF agents figured that this would be a safer approach than just heading up the Weavers' long and windy driveway to attempt to arrest them there, considering they believed that the Weavers were likely armed to the teeth. So when Randy stopped to assist what he thought was a motorist in need, the ATF agents, assisted by Boundary County sheriffs, apprehended him without much incident, though both Randy and Vicky were thrown down to the ground in the snow. Randy was then transported to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho for arraignment. He would appear before a magistrate who found probable cause existed for him to stand trial, and then released him under his own recognizance. Before doing so, however, the first of many missteps that led to the siege would occur, when, in a further attempt to coerce Randy to turn informant, the magistrate would erroneously tell him that if he was convicted, that he would be forced to surrender his home, 20 acres of land, and his truck in order to cover the cost of the trial. The magistrate would later admit that it was a falsehood told in hopes of convincing Weaver to break and to turn informant. Randy still refused. Here's the true irony of their tactics that most miss when they're covering the case, likely because this fact is one that they've done their best to obscure, but their desire to obtain informants within the group was never even needed. While the ATF and FBI were butting heads and running independent ops, 5 of the 6 key positions in the organization were already made up of agents from federal law enforcement and intel gathering services. So in other words, the Aryan Nations was effectively already a government-run operation, with agents spying on one another, trying to ensure the integrity of an investigation into what was an organization almost entirely run by the federal government. When Weaver was initially released, his court date was scheduled for February 19, 91, but was changed to February 20th of 91 to try and avoid a federal holiday and allow for more time to people to travel to the court after the holiday. But when the notice went out informing him about his court date, it was sent with the incorrect date of March 20th. The entire thing infuriated Vicky, who would send a letter to the U.S. Attorney Maurice Q. Ellsworth, addressing him as, quote, servant of the Queen of Babylon, going on to famously write, quote, the stink of your lawless government has reached heaven, the abode of Yahweh, our Yahshua, and ended with, whether we live or whether we die, we will not bow to your evil commandments. Needless to say, this did very little to help their case and would later be used in court evidence to help paint the Weaver family as crazy armed separatists as federal agents grasped at straws in any attempt to retroactively justify their actions. Chapter 5. The Nightmare. The version that you just heard regarding the court date is one of many. There's quite a bit of confusion surrounding when the dates changed, why they were changed, and who knew what and when. The letter incorrectly stating the dates as March 20th most likely came from Weaver's probation officer, Carl Richens, who had proven to be an ineffective go-between for the court to Weaver. Regardless who knew what and when, though, when Weaver failed to appear on the 20th of February, U.S. District Court Harold Lyman Ryan would issue a bench warrant for failure to appear. On February 26, a reporter for the Kuntai Valley Times would place a call to U.S. Probation Office asking if the reason Weaver didn't show up on the 20th of February was in fact because he had been sent the incorrect date by Richens. Chief Probations Officer Terrence Hummel would check this, and upon finding a copy of the letter that indeed did have the incorrect date, he would contact Judge Ryan's court clerk as well as the U.S. Marshals and Weaver's attorney, informing them of the mistake. Despite all of this, George Ryan refused to withdraw the bench warrant. The Marshal Service agreed to wait to act on the warrant until after March 20th to allow Weaver a chance to appear for what he believed was his court date. The U.S. Attorney's Office, however, would call a grand jury together on March 14th, 6 days before he was even set to appear, and since the Attorney's Office neglected to even tell the grand jury about the Richens letter, they issued an indictment for failure to appear based solely on the limited info that they were given. Bear in mind, all indications prior to this were that if he had appeared, all charges would likely have just been dropped over procedural errors. Unsure what to do next, the Weavers would come together as a family to decide their next actions, as they usually did according to Sarah's later memoirs. Since Randy's paranoia and distrust of government had been pushed to the extreme limit by being set up, and then the forceful arrest where he and Vicky were handcuffed and slammed face down into the snow, and amplified further by what he saw as the government trying to conspire to take away their mountain retreat that they had worked so hard for and that was supposed to be their place for safety against what they felt soon would come, they decided to do nothing. They felt that there was no way that Randy would receive a fair trial after everything that had happened, so they instead chose to focus on just surviving on the mountain, a full-time job in itself. The Weaver family would grow once again amidst all of this, and their newest addition, Elishaba, would be brought into the world in their recently constructed birthing shed on the property. 18 months would go by without any open actions by the government. However, shortly after the original missed court date, the ATF had began surveillance of the Weavers, who had become increasingly more isolated over those 18 months. When the Weaver case was passed from the ATF to the Marshal Service, they failed to inform them that they had done all of this in an attempt to turn Weaver into an informant for them. The Marshals are the law enforcement wing of the federal courts, and so it became their job to apprehend Randy and to bring him in since he was now considered a fugitive. On Randy's end, after all that had taken place, and still believing that he would lose his home and his land if he lost, what he saw was a rigged trial, and also believing that Vicky would be left homeless and his children would be taken away, he no longer had any desire to surrender or to play their games. The marshals would make several attempts to convince Weaver to turn himself in peacefully, but he would refuse to leave his cabin. And all of this would truly begin in earnest the standoff on Ruby Ridge. The ATF during this time would set up a complex system of audio and video surveillance of the property. Also during this time, the Marshal Service had begun flying FP-4 jets over the property equipped with cameras to map out the property in relation to the surrounding terrain. Negotiations would be ongoing from March 5th to October 12th of 91, and a surrender agreement had been reportedly reached at some point, but would become null and void when Assistant U.S. Attorney Ron Howen would put an end to all negotiations, directing instead for all future negotiations to go through Weaver's attorney, Hoffmeister, who he refused to talk to at this point. From that point, the initial soft standoff would truly begin, and the federal government would begin to fear looking weak more and more, especially when the news media became more and more interested in the case. Journalists would begin reaching out trying to be the first to secure an interview with the Weavers. They would all be unsuccessful, save for one, but by the time that interview took place, it was far too late. Meanwhile, beginning back in February of 91, a threat assessment would begin that likely played a pivotal role in the events of Ruby Ridge. U.S. Deputy Marshal Dave Hunt, a former Marine and 20-year law enforcement officer by this time, was responsible for conducting all of the threat assessments for the Idaho area at this point. The purpose of him conducting these was to separate fact from fiction and determine how much danger law enforcement would likely be looking at when apprehending or dealing with a particular suspect. For Randy Weaver, Hunt recorded that he and Vicky were driven by religious and political beliefs and very much influenced by the Old Testament, and that they would both be likely to lay down their lives for the cause if needed. There was also a significant amount of overstatements, incorrect assumptions, and potentially outright fabrications in his assessment. The assessment even opened by incorrectly describing Randy as a member of the Aryan Nation, as well as involved with Covenant sword in the arm of the Lord. Neither were true, but by grouping the Weavers with organizations that the feds already saw as domestic terrorism threats, it ratcheted up the perceived danger in the assessment. While Hunt himself preferred the diplomatic approach, this assessment would become a key component in the approach that was taken by both the Marshals and the FBI. Later, in the 1995 Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee report on the incident, this threat assessment would receive major criticism. As per that report, quote, "The subcommittee is concerned that, as marshals investigating the Weaver case learned facts that contradicted information they previously had been provided, they did not adequately integrate their updated knowledge into their overall assessment of who Randy Weaver was or what threat he might pose. If marshals made any attempt to assess the credibility of the various people who gave them information about Weaver, they never recorded their assessments." Then it would go on to say, quote, "These problems rendered it difficult for other law enforcement officials to assess the Weaver case accordingly without the benefit of first-hand briefings from persons who had continuing involvement with him." There is a lot more to that report as well, but in hopes of this not being a 3-hour episode already, we will go over some of that in the BTR. And I'll also go ahead and stick that report in the research folder over in the Discord as well, just in case you guys are interested in that. Many of the people that the marshals were talking to in order to get this info on the Weavers for the report were later assessed by the marshals as having been significantly more radical than the Weavers were. The brief psych profile that they had done was completed by someone with zero first-hand knowledge of or interviews with Mr. Weaver, and they were so unfamiliar with the case that he mistakenly called Weaver Mr. Randall repeatedly throughout the entirety of it. This is according to an internal DOJ memo that also stated the assessment exaggerated the threat that he posed. Getting back to the media's continued attempts to get interviews or to try everything possible to one-up one another with exclusives, another key moment where false information played a significant role in the perceptions of the Weavers, both in the eyes of the public and law enforcement, was about to unfold. For those old enough, you may remember the rush to condemn the Weavers and to paint them as dangerous extremists at war with the U.S. government, coming from virtually all media sources at the time. Very little first-hand info was known officially, and in the public's curiosity and the media's desire to get exclusives and eyes on the reporting, the vacuum of the unknown was quickly filled with blatant speculation and at times pure fabrication. One of the era's most well-known and, in my eyes, deplorable journalist was Geraldo Rivera. In his coverage of the case, he had hired a helicopter to do a flyover of the Weaver property and to get footage for his TV show, Now It Can Be Told. While it's unclear where the reports originated, that same day the U.S. Marshal Service received reports that Weaver had fired on the helicopter. That flyover took place on April 18th of 1992, the same day that Marshal W. Warren Mays was on site installing additional surveillance equipment overlooking the property. In his field report from that day, Mays mentioned seeing the helicopter near the property, but didn't report hearing any kind of gunfire. The pilot of that helicopter, Richard Weiss, would also unequivocally in his interview with the FBI state that Weaver never fired on his helicopter, nor did anyone else. Later, when the indictment of Weaver was presented to the grand jury, it was noted that the prosecution even had evidence that no shots were fired at it. But despite all of this counter evidence, Geraldo still reported the story as if it was factual, and it would later become part of the justification given in drawing up the rules of engagement, where they had instructed agents to kill on sight any adults that they saw with a firearm by U.S. Marshal Wayne Duke Smith and FBI HRT Commander Richard Rogers. It would also be later used in trial and presented as Overt Act Number 32 in the Weaver's conspiracy against the federal government charges. Those rules of engagement, drawn up largely based on incorrect information, speculation, and exaggerated reports, would be drafted on August 21st and amended on the 22nd, which brings us full circle to where we began this episode. So with everything that we've learned in mind, let's jump back into August 21st, 1992, and pick up where we left off with the events that took place immediately following the confrontation at the Y and the death of Sammy Weaver and U.S. Marshal Degan. Chapter 6. The Siege. There are multiple versions of how the initial confrontation played out. The first version that I shared was cobbled together and represents what seems to be the most widespread, though many details differ between those tellings. The Marshals have a totally different version. So does Kevin Harris and Randy Weaver, who wasn't at the Y, but was actually up the hill near the house, though he still partially saw and heard the events that took place. The other version is that of forensics and bullet analysis, which tends to align more closely with that of Harris and Randy than the Marshals, but it is still both hotly contested and become a major point of debate and criticism during the subsequent trials and committee reviews. Regardless how it all started, the way that it ended is pretty easy to ascertain. While shots were flying, Randy Weaver came to the edge of a parallel logging road and began yelling for Sammy and Kevin Harris to return to the cabin. Kevin recounts hearing Sammy yell back, "I'm coming, Dad!" before exiting cover and sprinting away up the hill towards the cabin. Then a sound that he described as a immediately followed by Sammy letting out a yelp before he went silent. He then heard someone from the woods on the Marshal side saying, I'm hit," followed by someone checking them before jumping out and into the road announcing themselves as U.S. Marshals. Allegedly, this was the first time that any of them had identified themselves in the entire proceedings. In the Marshals' version of events, they kept retreating and identifying themselves as U.S. Marshals until they had no choice but to stand their ground. I'll put all of the material in the research folder and you can make your own mind up about who you believe. Harris would circle back around the woods once the shooting ceased, only briefly popping out onto the upper trail to check on Sammy. He rolled him over, saw that he'd been shot from behind and was covered in blood. According to Harris, Sammy had no signs of life at this point. No pulse, his eyes were rolled back, his lips were turning blue. So he left him on his back and made his way back up to the cabin where he had the difficult task of informing the Weaver family that Sammy was dead. After the initial anger passed and eyes dried enough to see, Randy and Vicky decided to get Sammy's body back, while Harris stayed with the girls. He said that he knew when they found him because he could hear Vicky wailing and screaming as well as Randy. They would retrieve Sammy's body and return to the house without incident. Harris would help Randy carry his body to the small shed that had been constructed for the birth of their youngest daughter. On the Marshal side, they would regroup at this point, requesting immediate support from state law enforcement and also the FBI by telling them that a U.S. Marshal had been shot and killed. Following this call, the Marshal Service Crisis Center would be activated by Associate Director for Operations Duke Smith. The Marshal's SOG, or Special Operations Group, was told to deploy. The Boundary County Sheriff's Office also responded to the call, and then Idaho Governor Cecil Andrews would declare a state of emergency in Boundary County, which allowed for further assistance from the Idaho National Guard and use of their Armored Personnel Carriers, or APCs. Idaho State Police would also respond. The FBI would respond by dispatching its HRT, Hostage Rescue Team, aka Hostage Roasting Team, if you know, you know. The SAC of Salt Lake City FBI office, Eugene Glenn, would be the appointed site commander responsible for all active members on scene from the FBI, ATF, and U.S. Marshals, which had they done their due diligence in ensuring accuracy with the initial threat assessment, and had they kept it a living document that was updated with more accurate info as it became available, as they should have, then they would have known that this was a laughably excessive response to what really boiled down to two men with single-shot weapons. The day following the shootout was quiet on the Weaver side. They remained in the cabin virtually all day as the full force of the U.S. law enforcement apparatus came together around the property. Unbeknownst to them, the special rules of engagement had been fully drawn up and approved by FBI headquarters and the marshals. There were, in truth, only 4 primary rules, and all of them amounted to shoot on sight any adults or dogs if they are observed, key word there, with a weapon, or if any dog could possibly compromise their positions. The only caveat, which would soon be broken anyway, was that deadly force should only be deployed if the shot can be taken without endangering any children. A footnote to that section, but a crucial one, was that the word adult was later changed to adult male to exclude Vicky, which took place around 2:45 p.m. on the 22nd thanks to SAC Glenn, who made the call because she hadn't been seen at the initial scene where Degan was shot and killed. Regardless, the snipers interpreted, as they would later testify, that to mean shoot on sight. Late in the afternoon around dusk, the Weavers heard the dog that was tied up outside start to whine like he may be wrapped up in his chain, and Sarah wanted to check on him, and Randy already wanted to see Sammy. And some reports say that this was, he went outside in preparation to bury Sammy, but like I said, accounts differ about so much of this, it's really hard to tell. Regardless why they went out, it was nearly dark at this point, and Kevin Harris, knowing where some batteries were stashed outside for the flashlight, decided that he would accompany them. Sarah went to the dog, made sure that it was okay, and then headed to meet her father at the shed. As she arrived, a shot rang out, and a second later, a bullet ripped through Randy's shoulder from behind at a downward angle, tearing out through his armpit. Sarah pushed Randy behind the shed, where they both momentarily took cover. Randy called out to Vicky, letting her know that he had been hit, and Harris headed straight back down the driveway. At this point, Vicky opened the cabin door, with baby Elisha still in her arms, calling everyone back to the house as she stood in the doorway, one hand cradling the baby and the other keeping the door open and urging everyone back inside. The group fled back to the cabin, and just as Harris crossed the threshold passing Vicky, another loud shot from the sniper's rifle reverberated throughout the property. Kevin Harris collapsed to the ground as he passed over the threshold, bleeding from his upper chest and left shoulder area. Some reports incorrectly state that it was his right side, but in his own testimony at trial, he stated that he realized he had been hit when he could no longer feel his left hand. Meanwhile, behind the door to the cabin, more blood flew through the air at the same time. Seconds later, Vicky Weaver would collapse from a single fatal shot to the head. Rachel, who was standing nearby and watched the entire event play out, let out a gut-wrenching scream as Randy dashed to pick up baby Elisha off the floor where she had been dropped as Vicky was killed. Randy wiped the blood and brain matter off of the baby's face and handed her to Rachel so that he could check on Vicky. Vicky would convulse several times before going still. It was obvious that nothing could be done. The shots that injured Randy and killed Vicky, after passing through and injuring Harris, came from FBI sniper Lon Haruchi, who would later say that he fired the shots as both men faced away from him and Vicky stood in a doorway holding her infant daughter because he believed Weaver and Harris were, quote, preparing to shoot an FBI helicopter that was circling overhead at the time. Having already lost Stryker, Sammy, and Vicky, and with both the adult males badly injured and incapacitated, they all decided to just remain inside from then forward, fearing that if they went outside they would finish them all off. This is according to the testimony of Kevin Harris. For the following 9 days, the remaining Weavers and Harris stayed trapped in the house by fear, as the matriarch of the family slowly began to decompose inside with them. The entirety of the standoff they spent in there as bright searchlights flooded the cabin all night, every night, and as negotiators used speakers installed around the cabin and even two that they had placed under the floor of the kitchen to call out Vicky specifically, asking for surrender. One morning, even using a bullhorn to greet her specifically, saying that they had pancakes for breakfast and asking what she had. They would later claim that it wasn't taunting and that they didn't know that she was already dead. 4 days after Vicky's death, the rules of engagement would be revoked by SAC Glenn, who changed it to only shooting if the target poses a direct threat to them and as is necessary in self-defense. In other words, what rules of engagement virtually always been. The majority of the seasoned snipers from various branches on the scene felt the original rules were inappropriate, unprecedented, and, quote, a departure from the standard deadly force policy. The standoff would ultimately be resolved by a civilian negotiator not affiliated with government or law enforcement, but instead by James Gordon Bo Gritz, who was a retired United States Army Special Forces officer who had also served during the Vietnam War. It's now a figure in the anti-government, quote-unquote, militia movement. Gritz would speak with the Weavers at their cabin and brought a paper stating that the FBI promised if Harris would surrender that they would leave Weaver and his girls alone, and that Harris would be apprehended peacefully. Harris would surrender on day 10 of the siege and would be taken by a medical evac helicopter to Sacred Heart Medical Center in Spokane, Washington. Weaver also allowed for Vicky's body to be removed and tended to, but didn't yet trust that he wouldn't be killed, orphaning his remaining children if he walked outside. The FBI HRT commander, Richard Rogers, gave Bo Gritz a deadline at this point, and if the Weavers failed to surrender in the following days, then he would resolve the matter by launching a tactical assault on the home. Around this time, and just up the hill from the cabin, a friend and part-time employer of Weavers, along with a TV cameraman, saw a helicopter carrying a fuel cell that they were 100% certain was being ready to burn the Weavers out. This, along with a long line of details painting the agencies involved in a bad light, including the shooting of Vicky Weaver, were attempted to be swept under the rug at the conclusion of the siege. A siege that ended the following day on August 31st as Gritz convinced Randy that there was no other way and that they were prepared to kill them all and burn the place to the ground otherwise. Randy and his daughters would then peacefully surrender, bringing an end to the events on Ruby Ridge. Events that would be debated in both legal courts and the courts of opinion for many decades to come. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. On August 31st, 1992, seeing no other way out, and with his prevailing fears having been realized already, or threatened to happen if he had failed to surrender, Randy Weaver exited his once safe haven on Ruby Ridge for the final time with his hands in the air. He and his 3 daughters were taken into custody without further incident. Randy was then flown by the Marshal Service to Boise, where he would be detained for trial, while Sarah, the oldest daughter, who was 16 at the time, was briefly considered for prosecution as an adult. They would ultimately decide that there wasn't enough evidence to charge her. And so, in the end, all 3 daughters would be released to relatives. In the days that immediately followed Randy's surrender, he would be arraigned and thus would begin a string of hard-fought legal battles, followed by civil litigation that would forever alter federal ROE and ultimately leave a stain on the government that could never fully be washed away. Luckily for Randy, he would catch the break of a lifetime. One of the greatest trial lawyers of all time, and literal Trial Lawyer Hall of Fame member, which if you didn't know that was really a thing, you're not alone, neither did I, and widely considered one of, if not the greatest lawyers of the 20th century, would watch the events of Ruby Ridge transpire and saw it as the government having overreached massively and called it, quote, a monstrous injustice by the government. Enter a man by the name of Gerald, or Jerry as he was better known, Spence. And while he was on the verge of retiring at the end of an unparalleled career, he felt what had been done to the Weavers was, in his view, an embodiment of government overreach, a wrongful use of force, and more broadly a threat to civil liberties, all causes that Spence had come to be known for. Spence would even volunteer his services pro bono, due to how much he believed in the case. Another lucky break for Randy, because he could never have afforded even a decent lawyer at this point, much less one the caliber of Spence, a man who had never lost a criminal trial before a jury, either as a prosecutor or as a defense attorney. He knew from previous battles against the legal arm of the federal government that Weaver would never receive a fair trial without a serious defense team. It wouldn't be Spence going it alone, though. He also assembled a legal dream team around him, including David Nevin, a man who already was building a strong record in the Idaho legal system and would go on to become a legend in his own right. And Nevin would end up just representing Kevin Harris, largely just to work with Spence, as well as Kent Spence, Gary's own son, who was then a rising star in his own right, would go on to cement a position in the National Trial Lawyers Top 100. He also brought in Chuck Peterson as co-counsel, and Peterson's partner in his firm, Gary Gilman. In addition to this legal dream team, he also brought in several specialists, including ballistics and tactical operations experts, for consulting purposes. When Spence met with Randy, he started the meeting by explicitly telling Randy that while he didn't share his political or religious beliefs, he did believe that he deserved a fair trial regardless. A trial that would begin on April 14th of 1993 with Assistant U.S. Attorney Ron Howen anchoring the prosecutory team along with Kim Lindquist. Howen, who had been assigned previously to prosecute the original weapons charges, was a confident, competent, and known to be aggressive prosecutor who had a history of going after white supremacists with a high degree of success. Along with the original ATF weapons charge, Weaver was also charged with 9 other counts, including first-degree murder for the death of Marshal Degan, assaulting and resisting federal officers, conspiracy to provoke a violent confrontation, the original failure to appear charge, and using a firearm to commit a violent crime, among others. Kevin Harris was tied in as co-defendant, facing many of the same charges, but with some applying only to one or the other. While Weaver faced the making illegal firearms, failure to appear, committing an offense while on release, and using a firearm to commit a violent crime, despite not even firing a weapon at anyone throughout the standoff, Harris faced the other co-charges, with harboring a fugitive being his only separate charge. Over the course of the next 62 days, a highly scrutinized and dramatic legal proceeding would take place, one that exposed significant flaws in the conduct of federal law enforcement agencies, as Gary Spence put on a legal clinic on how to pick apart a prosecution's case. Spence didn't even call a single witness. Instead, he built a masterful case solely by his cross-examining of the prosecution's witnesses and calling out inconsistencies in their evidence and testimonies. While the prosecution and marshals attempted to blame the initial shootout on Harris being the aggressor, who along with Stryker the dog and young Sammy Weaver stalked the marshals down and callously gunned down Marshal Degan unprovoked despite knowing that he was a U.S. Marshal. However, ballistics and crime scene evidence painted a very different picture, one where the marshals had initiated the conflict by shooting the family dog, as well as Weaver's son, and argued successfully that any subsequent actions by Harris was done in self-defense. A pivotal moment in the trial was Spence's successful effort to challenge the credibility of federal agents. He would introduce evidence that the rules of engagement used by the FBI snipers was unconstitutional in allowing the shooting of any armed adult without warning or provocation, which did serious damage to the government's case. A final nail in the coffin came when the defense highlighted untimely production of crucial FBI documents during the trial, leading the judge to end up fining the FBI for failure to obey court orders. After the roughly 62-day marathon of a trial, the jury would then deliberate for roughly another 20 more days before reaching a verdict. On July 8th, the courtroom was tense, with only the jury aware of what was coming next. Weaver and Harris sat side by side, each man fully aware that, for better or worse, everything was coming down to this. Their attorneys collectively had delivered 62 days worth of near-flawless work, but now their futures rested in the hands of 12 jurors, 5 men and 7 women, who were moments away from deciding their fate. After weeks of trial and nearly 3 weeks of deliberation, the jurors filed back into the courtroom, and for just a moment time seemed to pause. Then came the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, the jury finds you both not guilty. A wave of emotion swept over both men and the entire gallery. On conspiracy charges, not guilty. In the end, both men were acquitted of all of the charges related to the siege. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. Kevin Harris would be acquitted on all counts, but the story wasn't quite over for Weaver. He would ultimately be convicted, but only on the original charges that he faced related to the weapons charge and the failure to appear. His sentence, 18 months in prison and a fine, was largely symbolic, as his time already served shortened that sentence. He was given credit for the 14 months that he had already spent in jail awaiting trial, and then sentencing, plus an additional 3 months for good behavior. He would return to jail after the trial to await sentencing, which would happen on October 18th of the same year. He would be confined in Canyon County Jail, Caldwell, Idaho, following his sentencing, where he would only remain until his release 2 months later on December 17th. He would also receive 3 years probation and a $10,000 fine. A fine that would soon look like chump change, when the following year, 1994, Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris would both file separate civil lawsuits against the U.S. government and a number of specific federal officials who were involved in the Ruby Ridge operation. The officials that were named included Lon Harucci, the FBI sniper whose shots killed Vicki Weaver and wounded Harris, G. Wayne Duke Smith of the U.S. Marshal Service, Assistant Director for Operations, Henry Hudson, the Acting Director of the U.S. Marshal Service, Larry Potts, a high-ranking FBI official who officially approved the controversial rules of engagement used by the snipers, Steve McGavin, an FBI official involved in the operation, as well as several other federal agents and officials involved with the siege. While the government made several attempts to have the case thrown out, namely over the individuals involved claiming qualified immunity, a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals rejected the immunity claim. The following civil fallout was substantial. The Weaver family's wrongful deaths over the killing of Vicki and Sammy would be settled out of court once it was ruled that the qualified immunity didn't apply and the case would proceed. In 1995, the U.S. government would settle for $3.1 million. Under the terms of the settlement, Randy was awarded $100,000. And each of the 3 daughters received $1 million each. Kevin Harris's civil lawsuit against the federal government wouldn't be settled for 6 years. In September of 2000, they would finally settle the last remaining Ruby Ridge civil case, where Harris would be awarded $380,000 in exchange for dismissal of his remaining claims, but explicitly stated that the payment did not constitute an admission of liability or guilt by the federal government or its employees. Chapter 8. The remaining fallout and some final thoughts. In 1997, the prosecutor for Boundary County, Idaho, Denise Woodbury, would file a state court complaint charging FBI sniper Lon Haruchi with involuntary manslaughter for the killing of Vicki Weaver. The complaint would be brought after the DOJ investigated the incident and determined that a case of willfulness or knowing intentional use of unreasonable force cannot be made out against FBI agent Lon Haruchi. So instead, the state of Idaho, which was under fire at the time for what the public had come to see as it standing back and letting the feds roll over the rights of some of its citizens and ultimately murder 2 of them, charged Haruchi in violation of Idaho Code 18-4006, subsection 2. The complaint alleged that Haruchi, quote, did unlawfully but without malice kill Vicki J. Weaver in the operation of a firearm through the front door of the Weaver residence in an attempt to shoot Kevin Harris. He would challenge the case, but the state magistrate, Judge Quentin Hardin, would find sufficient evidence to support the complaint. The state would issue an information, which just means their prosecutor has formally charged a person with a crime without a grand jury indictment. And a week later, Haruchi removed the case to federal district court in an effort to move to dismiss the indictment on the grounds of supremacy clause immunity. The district court would grant his motion without an evidentiary hearing, and Idaho, to their credit, appealed that. The supremacy clause, in a nutshell, just means that states are bound by federal law, and it nullifies any inconsistent state laws that are, not congruent with what the federal law says. I won't bore you with getting bogged down in the back and forth debate of its validity in this case, or all of the preceding court case precedents that have debated the situational use of it. I'll just say, since there was no evidentiary hearing and the claim was in dispute, the court refused to grant the motion because it felt that the evidence raised a genuine factual issue, whether he was acting pursuant to U.S. law and doing no more than necessary to do so. Haruchi would claim in his defense that he acted reasonably because he was trying to kill Harris in order to prevent him from harming law enforcement. He would attempt to paint Weaver as a Rambo-like figure, commanding an unknown number of heavily armed white separatists who had fired indiscriminately at deputy marshals the previous day, killing Deputy Marshal Degan. Then Haruchi claimed that he saw 3 individuals exit the cabin, one armed with a long gun, and Weaver made a, quote, threatening gesture towards an FBI helicopter that was in the area. So he shot Weaver to protect it, but thought that he missed, and when he saw them running back to the open door of the cabin, he shot Harris, who had the gun, before he could reach safety, from where he would be able to turn around and shoot the helicopter or escape. Then he claimed to never see Vicki and wasn't aware that she was even there. In his testimony at the Weaver trial, though, he admitted he never actually saw the helicopter, and he gave inconsistent answers on where he thought that the helicopter was, which when combined with shooting Weaver, who was unarmed, and in the back, and all of his backpedaling on the helicopter, basically completely disproves his justification. Plus, they were all in radio contact with command, and had any of the agents felt that the chopper was actually in danger, one would have expected them to have warned the pilot at least, which, of course, never happened. He was also aware that the trained FBI pilot, who was well aware of the danger and was taking appropriate actions and avoiding rifle range throughout the entirety of the standoff. In fact, earlier that very day, Haruchi had gone up himself with that same pilot on a recon mission, and that he had noted that the pilot, quote, popped over the hill low and then came back over, as not to present a clear target. He also testified previously that, quote, we stayed well out of range of the cabin during the flight, end quote. This is just one example of his many contradictions that negated his claims of being innocent and only acting in the line of duty. Haruchi wasn't just a sniper who was following orders. He was the leader of the sniper team, and he knowingly instructed his men to follow the original rules of engagement rather than the amended ones that reflected the constitutional use of deadly force only in case of a direct threat, making his actions unprecedented in the fact that the act of taking a human life was pre-planned. Randy testified before the Senate subcommittee about that day, saying, quote, All was quiet, and had they heard a helicopter at the time, all of them would have ran back to the cabin immediately. Other testimony throughout the series of trials also supported that the supposed helicopter may not have even been in the area at the time of the shooting. The subcommittee also investigated the shooting and stated, quote, "There is reasonable basis to conclude that the rules of engagement, more than any fear for the safety of the helicopters, prompted Horiuchi to take the first shot." This matter would be debated in 2001 with a full en blanc panel of the Ninth Circuit, which just meant that it was all active judges on the panel, who would ultimately reverse the prior dismissal, concluding that there was enough factual and legal uncertainty to require Horiuchi stand trial on the state manslaughter charge. In September of 2001, before a third en blanc rehearing could be convened, the then new Boundary County prosecutor Brett Benson, who had defeated Woodbury in the 2000 election, suddenly announced that the county would drop the charges against Horiuchi. Despite strong evidence and a likely conviction, the state manslaughter charge was dropped and never tried to a verdict. As a result, no criminal conviction was ever entered against Horiuchi for the killing of Vicki Weaver. The decision was widely panned by civil rights advocates and many legal commentators who agreed that the procedural immunities created an effective shield for federal agents, even where a homicide of a civilian occurs under dubious circumstances, and in cases with a substantial factual evidence of reckless disregard or negligent lethal force. If you ask 10 people their views on Ruby Ridge, what took place and why, you'll likely hear at least 10 different answers, all colored by the version of events that they heard and their personal feelings on the subjects of the matter. It should be noted that the Weavers were very controversial figures for both their beliefs and their actions. However, much of what was widely reported at the time was skewed towards justifying the government's actions, all while exaggerating both the beliefs and intentions of the Weaver family. Since so many versions of the story exist and there are so many contradictions throughout all of them, not just between agencies or secondary coverage, but quite frequently within the documents of the same agencies and oftentimes within the text of the exact same document, this story is a hard one to get a firm grasp on, much less to accurately fully understand. It was, needless to say, extremely difficult to accurately summarize and fact-check. In cases where stories conflicted, I've done my best, as I always do, to try and lean to the side that has the preponderance of supporting evidence. Still though, I'm not immune to making mistakes, and there is honestly enough material here to have easily made this a 3 or more part series. So while this was admittedly a very long episode, there is still plenty of meat left on its bones should you want to grab the research folder, it'll be in the Discord when the BTR drops, and dig in for yourself. I honestly encourage you to do so. If you want my thoughts on the case and why it is still so very important to understand even all these years later, then I invite you to check out the BTR, where I'll be breaking all of this down some and also filling some gaps or correcting any parts that I may discover, if there's any verifiable errors that I made in this episode over the coming days. And that isn't to try and compel people into listening to the BTR. It's because this episode is already pretty damn long, and I would really rather just kind of wrap this up as its own conclusive thing without diving into all of my thoughts or theories or anything else. But if you are curious on hearing my thoughts about it and getting any extra details, then you are invited to come join us next week for the BTR for this episode. But just to quickly summarize though, Ruby Ridge forces us to look directly at the truth. It forces us to ask what safeguards that we have against government tyranny, which actually work and which are simply theater, as well as who pays the price when the system decides that someone is a threat before the evidence proves it. By the way, on the 4th day of the Weaver trial, a news event that would be pointed to as another clear example of overreach and excessive force by federal forces would rock the entire country. The jurors of the Weaver trial were told not to watch the news, to ignore the incident altogether. Maybe they did, but the country did watch, and what many saw was yet another sign that their government was becoming increasingly comfortable with murdering citizens who dared resist in any meaningful way. And even as its flames burned out, a spark had already spread in the minds of many, and what was once just a fringe militia movement slowly began to reignite in many places where it had long been stamped out, one that would require the government to take drastic measures that would inevitably lead us back to Oklahoma City. In episode 13 of this season, we will be taking a look back into those flames. I hope that you'll join us, but we'll talk more about that in the BTR. Until then, take care of yourselves out there. Take care of one another whenever you can. And I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.